We now want to turn our attention to a related issue, and that is the ongoing, or I don't know if I should even call them ongoing, but the sort of ongoing, off and on, whatever you want to call them, talks between the United States and Iran about the possibility of whether or not to have some sort of deal or whether or not this will collapse into an even greater conflict between the two nations, which of course many American foreign policymakers really want to see happen. So to discuss this and perhaps more, very happy to be joined here by Assal Rad, who is a historian of the modern Middle East and a non-resident fellow at Dawn. Assal, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here with us. I guess here's my first question: is where do you think things stand? I mean, how realistic does it seem? It seems like the two parties are pretty far apart, especially in terms of what the U.S. demands are on Iran. So, I mean, does it feel like the sort of horizon of a deal that maybe about a month or two ago seemed possible is receding, or what do you think there?
I would say in many ways we're precisely where we were, which is confused because it's not clear what the negotiations are. And that's been the problem from the US side is that you have sort of conflicting statements in what appears to be an internal difference in the Trump administration on how they want to handle Iran. Uh, which is not that surprising. I mean, having hawkish voices, it's the same thing on the Democratic side, right? Having hawkish voices on Iran is sort of a staple of US foreign policy. So what if you listen to President Trump himself, it seems like he wants a deal. That's the language that he continues to be using, and that's the same signals you're getting on the Iranian side. I think, the Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi really summarized the basic conflict of how you would get a deal or no deal. He tweeted something like, if it's very simple, no nuclear weapons equals a deal, no enrichment equals no deal. So this is one of the impediments that we're working on. Of course, there's going to be layers of impediments. That's the other part I think people fail to understand is even if they reach an agreement, there are legal impediments on the American side to actually give Iran the sanctions relief that would theoretically be promised to it in a deal that would then see limitations to its nuclear program to prevent it from having a nuclear weapon. Now, a deal between the US and Iran might go beyond what the original JCPOA was. It might be more limited than what the original JCPOA was. But the problem in trying to sort of predict the current situation is that there is not consistent messaging from the American side. But there is at least positive messaging, you could say, from the president himself. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's not a great answer because it's not an answer, but that's because we don't have the details of what they're discussing. I will say, if the Iranian side is engaging in discussions, they would not engage in discussions that would place them at zero enrichment. That was precisely what the deal breaker and the non-starter was under the Bush administration in the early 2000s. And so this is a point that's been emphasized over and over again. Now, how they resolve that issue, that's something that we can discuss more.
So what you're saying is you don't have a crystal ball, but so I guess we'll just have to take that.
Especially.
But I do want to ask you about the wrecker and all this. Not that the U.S. isn't capable of wrecking it themselves, but there is this pattern of every time there's momentum towards diplomacy with Iran, the Israelis intervene to shut it down, whether through political pressure, sabotage, sometimes outright violence. And, we just saw this report from CNN, I think about a week ago now, saying that U.S. intelligence, well, it was a report that was actually leaked to CNN by U.S. intelligence, so that says something, but that this new U.S. intelligence suggests that Israel is preparing a possible strike on Iranian nuclear facilities without the U.S.'s permission, involvement to basically derail the talks. So I'm curious of what how you understand the Israeli element here, because it does seem like, obviously there's not very much night and day whatsoever when it comes to the Israelis and Americans on Gaza, but on Iran there does seem to be.
The Israelis are certainly play the potential role of a spoiler. I mean, there are spoilers on both sides in terms of like the hardline camps. We call them hardliners in Iran and hawks in the US. But the role of Israel specifically is obviously something important to talk about because what's interesting is you have Israeli officials saying, even if there is a deal between the US and Iran, that Israel won't be bound by that deal. The reason I say that's interesting is because Israel is the largest recipient of US foreign aid than any other country in the world historically. Um, Israeli officials have said themselves within the defense and security sectors that without US aid and assistance, they would not be able to do anything that they've been doing, all the genocide in Gaza, the wars that they're continuing in Lebanon and Syria, anywhere that they're occupying or carrying out attacks wouldn't be possible without US support. And yet, the Israeli government takes a sort of staunch line as if the leverage is in the opposite direction, and that leaves a lot of questions to be asked. Why is it that Israel can undermine U.S. policies while the U.S. is providing billions of dollars, billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars in military aid, as well as providing, I think, something close to 70% of Israel's arms imports. So there's a sort of odd asymmetry in power, and yet if you look at the language used by the two sides, you would think that the asymmetry is in favor of Israel, when in fact it's the US that holds all the leverage. Now, while it's clear that the Trump administration and President Trump himself is a staunch supporter of Israel and has essentially given them, very similar to his predecessor, a green light to do whatever they want in terms of Gaza, it seems like there is a little bit of pushback in terms of an Israeli attack on Iran, because that would derail something that President Trump, by all appearances, very much wants. I mean, he uses the language of a deal maker. He wants to say that he's accomplished these foreign policy goals, and one of them is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon through a deal. And it's interesting, if you look at the Iranian side, they've picked up on these signals and they're starting to use that language. They're starting to reciprocate that language. So the fact that Khamenei, the Iran supreme leader, has said he doesn't have an issue with U.S. investment in Iran, or the fact that Iran's foreign minister has used the language of like $1 trillion potential, economic potential for the U.S. in case of if there is a deal. All of that points to the fact that there seems to be the idea of mutual benefit when it comes to Iran and the U.S. This, of course, is not what Israel wants at all. They never wanted detente between Iran and the U.S. Because Iran is their way of using Iran as an existential threat to Israel, is its way of always arguing that Israel is on the defensive. Even when they're committing genocide, somehow Israel is always on the defensive, and pointing to Iran tends to be the way rhetorically they try to accomplish this sort of narrative. And if there's detente between the US and Iran, that undermines that narrative in many ways, because Iran becomes less of a threat if you have the US president saying, well, we've blocked every road to a nuclear weapon.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this issue that you mentioned earlier of the sort of enrichment aspect of this, because the sort of civilian military uses of nuclear power is obviously a major issue in the discussions. And I think the way it's presented, sort of in the Western media, is that this is always sort of a stalking horse, and that sort of there is no legitimate civilian technological reasons why Iran would want to have, nuclear power. And it's all just a cover to build a weapon at some point and, break out capacity and all that kind of stuff. So I just wonder how you evaluate some of that discourse.
For Iran, there's a number of reasons why enrichment is important. It's important because it has obviously energy applications when you're enriching to a certain level. For instance, the JCPOA limited Iran's enrichment to 3.67%. You need 90% enrichment for a weapon. So we're nowhere close to that when you're enriching at 3.67%. But it has the energy applications and the research applications, which it's certainly not my area of expertise, but I think everybody is aware of the fact that there are scientific, medical, other research purposes that go behind nuclear research. And so those are the civilian purposes that we're talking about. But there's a secondary reason behind it too, and that's the fact that Iran, under international law, as a signatory to the NPT, has the right to enrich. So there's a sort of question of sovereignty, where any outside power, any foreign power, can tell Iran, you're not allowed to do this because we say so, when it's outside the framework of international laws. That in the sort of psyche of the Iranian side, especially the Iranian government, is seen as surrender or a concession to a foreign power, which would be the United States. And so those are the elements that play into it. The language that's used in the West when it comes to this sort of idea of no enrichment is to create a false narrative that if Iran is enriching at all, or if any country is enriching at all, then they become a nuclear threat. When in reality, if there are international inspections on those programs, I mean, Iran is even just recently, there are reports that they are considering the idea of actually having US inspectors as part of a deal. allowing US inspectors in along with international inspectors. So if you have a nuclear program with oversight and limitations, that prevents it from being a weaponized program. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, the fascinating part about all this discussion and going back to Israel is that the only country in the Middle East that actually has nuclear weapons is Israel. And we never talk about that. It's not even something that the United States government will acknowledge. It's not something that the Israeli government will acknowledge. But it tells you something about the notion of threat and the language of threat when Israel is a state that is committing genocide currently and has nuclear weapons, and yet that is never a question that is raised.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And you have also been somebody who's been covering the genocide in Gaza, the media, the abysmal media coverage that 19 months into this just gets worse somehow than before. And so I'm just curious if, given the reality of the region right now, which is a lot different than the last time a deal was negotiated. Iran is in a weaker position after these 19 months of genocide that have pretty much, devastated a lot of the partners across the region of Iran, whether we're talking about, Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, the total loss of the government that was partnered with Iran in Syria. It's a much different situation now, and I'm just curious, do you think that that sort of shift in the balance of power will play into what gets agreed to or compromised on if this deal continues to go forward?
I mean, a lot of things have changed in the last 10 years. We're not dealing with the same world. We're not dealing with the same global order. We're not dealing with the same states. Everything in the landscape, not just in the region, but also in the United States, has completely changed. And so I certainly think that all of those changes will play into the way these negotiations will manifest. At the same time, the Iranian government has been very clear about its position on negotiations. They're open to negotiations. They seem to want a deal as well. That seems to be what the Trump administration wants. Will they concede entirely because they see themselves in a position of weakness? That might affect the way that they're going to negotiate, but I don't think the red lines will change on any side really. It's the question right now is what are the actual US red lines? Because that is not clear from the language that we're hearing from different administration officials. I think very similarly to 2015, what drew Iran to the negotiating table was actually having a negotiating partner. And I think the language of this Trump administration is different than the language of the first Trump administration. There's more sort of optimism and discussion. I mean, you can hear it in the way that President Trump talks about it himself. It's not that he doesn't have a hardline position on Iran, he clearly does. But at the same time, there seems to be actual space for negotiations and less of a maximalist approach. And if that continues to be the case, then I think there is space for some kind of resolution between these two states, which are really the main parties, right? This is supposed to include Europe, but essentially the negotiation is between Iran and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to follow and a lot to continue to follow, and we certainly will. And we really thank you for helping us sort through all of this. Assal Rad, non-resident fellow at Dawn and historian, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.